would be on page 4. The second full paragraph in the motion where it says Mr. Canvasser moved to deny both variances. At the end of the third line, it said he also noted that the petition, it should be that the petitioner, so change petition to petitioner. Board members, any other changes to the minutes? Mr. Lilly?
Yes, on page 6. In the motion itself, you go down the bold print, you go down 5 lines. The line starts off existing / proposed. It should be existing / proposed garage is 69.5%. So strike out is the, and then down in the line 10 or the second line from the bottom of that paragraph, again, it starts off existing / proposed. Delete is the.
Hey, Chuck, could you go back to the first one? What line was that?
Line 5. Both lines start off existing / proposed.
And remove is the from both?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Got it.
Any other changes to the minutes? Seeing none, do we have a motion? Mr. Lilly?
I'll make a motion to approve the December 8th, 2020 minutes as corrected.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Charles Lilly, a second by Mr. Richard Lilly. Could we please call the roll?
Charles Lilly,
Yes.
Richard Lilly,
Yes.
John Miller,
Yes.
Eric Morganroth,
Yes.
Francis Rodriguez,
Yes.
Ron Reddy,
Yes.
Jason Canvasser.
Yes. All right, thank you. Now turning to our first and only appeal of the evening, appeal number 21-01 for the property at 469 and 479 North Old Woodward. Mr. Cowan, I believe that's you.
Good evening, everyone. Is the site plan up on the share screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. I'm Brooks Cowan with the Birmingham Planning Department, presenting the first appeal of the year, appeal number 21-01. The owner of the property, known as 469-479 South Old Woodward Avenue, requests the following dimensional variances to construct a 5-story mixed-use building. For variance A, Chapter 126, Article 3, Section 3.04 D5 of the zoning ordinance requires that off-street parking contained in the first story shall not be permitted within 20 feet of any building facade, on a frontage line, or between the facade and the frontage line. The owner has proposed 7 parking spaces within 20 feet of the building frontage facing Hazel. Therefore, a dimensional variance, 20 feet, is being requested. And for variance B, Chapter 126, Article 4, Section 4.25 LD021 of the zoning ordinance requires that each building used for mixed-use commercial and residential use shall supply on the site of the building a minimum of 2 off-street loading zones and 2 refuge storage areas. And loading spaces are required to be 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 14 feet high in dimension. The owner has proposed 1 loading space on site. Therefore, a dimensional variance of 1 loading space is requested. The subject property is zoned B3 in the underlying zone and D4 in the downtown overlay zone. On September 23rd, 2020, the subject property appeared before the planning board for final site plan approval for the 5-story mixed-use building. The planning board approved the proposed site plan with conditions including the applicant receive a variance for the 2 loading spaces and the 7 parking spaces along the Hazel frontage. Regards to variance A, the ordinance prohibits first floor on-site parking to be within 20 feet of the frontage line, as we have on these 7 spaces here. The applicant is proposing these in order to provide parking spaces for the first floor commercial spaces we have along South Old Woodward and Woodward. The subject property is not within the parking assessment district. Therefore, the subject site is required to provide all parking for commercial and residential use on site. We are aware that this annotation says 8. However, that's a mistake. There are 7 along this frontage within 20 feet here. The subject site has proposed 5,201 square feet of commercial space on the first floor. And the subject site is also along the retail frontage line on South Old Woodward. And that requires the applicant to provide retail within the first 20 feet of the building that faces South Old Woodward, which is over here. So that has to meet the city's definition of retail use within the first 20 feet. The 3,968 square feet of first floor retail requires 13 parking spaces, while the 1,233 square foot lobby requires an additional 2, totaling a requirement of 15 parking spaces for the commercial space on the first floor. The current site plan indicates 14 on the first floor, which are accessible by car from Hazel Street only. And again, it's the 7 spaces of those 14 that do not meet the ordinance. In regards to parking, the subject site has 2 levels of underground parking, level P2 having 37 spaces and level P1 having 33 spaces. When including the proposed 14 on the first floor, the building has a total of 84 spaces for the entire site, and giving the proposed commercial space as well as the 50 residential units, the building is required to provide a total of 75. So they have an excess of 9 parking spaces. And with the planning department, we go by totals. So commercial plus residential, what is that number versus what is provided? How the property owner allocates parking spaces between the floors or the different uses of commercial and residential, that is up to them. So in regards to variance B, the zoning ordinance requires mixed-use buildings within the B3 zone to provide 2 loading spaces on site that are 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 14 feet high. The applicant has proposed a loading receiving area on the east side of the building facing Woodward Avenue, and this space is 1,030 square feet in area. The size of the room, allows 1 loading space that meets the zoning ordinance requirements. However, it's not long enough to accommodate 2. Therefore, they've requested a variance of 1 loading space. And as indicated in the attached planning board minutes from September 23rd, the planning board was in favor of the 7 parking spaces along Hazel Street for reasons that include that this site is the only site that's zoned D4 in the overlay that's not included in the parking assessment district. Another reason is that Hazel Street is not a busy street, they were saying, and retail there would be facing a concrete wall on the other side. This is the parking structure for 555 across the street. They didn't find that requiring retail here would activate the street. And a third reason is that it appears that these parking spaces would service the retail on the corners of the building, which face main streets, and that the spaces would help supplement these retail ones, which they find do activate the busy commercial areas. So the applicant has provided floor plans. Let me scroll through, it's moving kind of slow. So variance A, again, 7 spaces within the first 20 feet. They show the hash marks here. The building fronts 3 streets, Southwood, Woodward, Hazel, and Woodward. Technically, according to the ordinance, you're not allowed to have parking within 20 feet of any of that. And with here, it's required to be retail. And then they also provided a floor plan indicating examples of trucks that could fit into their receiving area. So if you follow the dashed X within the rectangle, that is 12 by 40 feet in dimension, which meets the ordinance. So they show they could get one in there. The applicant did provide another example of a 12 by 40 dimension within the Hazel Street entrance and exit point. However, the space is 19 feet wide, and city staff were not willing to approve that as a second loading space due to it blocking off ingress and egress to the other spaces. But the applicant wanted to show the different kinds of U-Hauls and moving trucks, cargo van, a regular bed truck here. And then from staff, we wanted to show, here's the downtown overlay zoning districts. And this in blue along Hazel is the D4 zone, surrounded by D5. And then, as mentioned earlier, it's the only D4 zone not in the parking assessment district. And just to kind of go over that, if you're inside of this parking assessment district, this red barrier, you're not required to provide parking for commercial space. You can use the structures to count towards that. You don't have to provide the zoning ordinance requirements. You do have to provide parking for your residential requirements. However, the subject site is located right here. You see the Hazel label outside of the parking assessment district, therefore zone D4 overlay. However, it's required to provide parking for both commercial uses and residential. And then for reference, I provided the city map, the online, however, it can be slow sometimes. So here's the entire B3 zone in the underlay. Here's the subject property. And another example of the zoning map. Here's where they are D4 as a reference point. So with that, I leave it to the board with any questions.
Thank you. Board members, any questions? Mr. Morganoff. You're on mute. There you go.
Mr. Clowen, thank you for a very thorough presentation. Is there any correlation between the number of loading zones relative to the square footage of the commercial? I thought we approved something, maybe the converted church in Birmingham, because of the amount of commercial space or the location. Is there any kind of correlation between how much you need relative to the square footage of the building or the square footage of the space?
There is, and this property is unique for loading in that it's in a B3 zone where it identifies to loading for mixed-use commercial spaces. However, the loading requirements, if you are commercial or industrial, it's one loading space. You are 20,000 square feet or under. Zero loading spaces if you're 5,000 square feet under, and 20 to 50,000 square feet requires 2, and then over 50,000 square feet requires 3 loading spaces. And so for the majority of the zones in the city, it's based on that range of square footage. B3 specifies if you're mixed use, it's got to be 2.
Also, I live very close to this project, and there's, I know, a bunch of city spots, parking spots running along the side of the building where these enclosed parking spots would be. Do they have any impact on quantity or what can be done?
Right, let me pull up the share screen again and go to floor plan. This indicates 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, the ones I'm referring to are on Hazel.
So I don't believe that they're adding more on-street spaces on their side of Hazel, which they can require. These ones across the street, they're not technically allowed to request to be a part of their parking count.
Oh, okay.
So, however, these spaces are open and available to anyone willing to pay the meter fee or who wants to go around there.
And knowing those spots on Hazel are not usually occupied, why can't they request those to achieve some of the requirement?
It's the way that the zoning ordinance is worded, in that the applicant is only able to request spots immediately adjacent to the property. So we faced a number of these questions before, and that they can't go across the street and require on-street spaces. It would have to be touching the property.
Okay.
They
Thank
have
you.
to be on this side. Yep.
I'm done, Mr. Chairperson.
Any other, Mr. Charles Lilly?
Yes, a couple questions. In looking at the building as it exists today, it looks like they have the parking right along the wall on Hazel.
Correct.
Inside the building.
Correct. I think you can see those even from driving by from the gates.
Yes. So was this building built before or after the current ordinance was adopted?
To be honest, I'm not sure the age of the building, nor the age of the ordinance. It
I can
seems like
answer that. I can answer that, Brooks.
Okay.
Chairman Lilly, the building predates the current ordinance requirements. I think the overlay district standards came in 97, 98, 99, right in that time frame, and the existing building is older than that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cohen, on you showed the map there that the property to the north and to the south of this property are zone D5. At one time, were they zone D4? Were either one of them zone D4?
Right. They used to be zoned D4. I believe it was in 2017. I believe. Don't quote me on that. I had left as an intern to go work somewhere else. I believe that happened.
Okay, so the Birmingham Place and 555 were rezoned to D5. What, you know the reason for that?
The reason is that those were built because they were above the height limit restrictions of 5 stories, and so they were considered a legal non-conforming building. The height requirements and limits for Birmingham have changed throughout the years to where at one point Birmingham Place and 555 could build their 9-story building and 13-story building. The height requirements for the city were then lowered, and so thereby creating a legal nonconformity for Birmingham Place in the 555, and they were running into a number of issues being legal nonconformities. And so therefore one of the reasons the planning board and city commission approved the D5 was to create a zone that was more amenable to buildings of that higher structure and status.
Okay, thank you. And then you've previously indicated that this is the only D4 property zone D4 that's not in the parking assessment district.
Right. You can see that it's here. This is the blue. These are where the properties are located, and this is the parking assessment district map. The properties are located outside the boundary here. Therefore, they have to provide all parking on site for commercial and residential.
All right, one final question. If we were to grant the variance for the loading dock, does the city think that the loading space is adequate?
That it would depend on the size of the truck and the number of trucks bringing into the building as they showed in their site plan. Let me pull that one up again. That generally when moving into a residential place, let me zoom in on this. They show trucks typical of moving, so a 1-bedroom they showed here. We're doing a 3 to 4 bedroom longer trucks. In terms of loading, it would just depend on how much stuff a person has. However, in most commercial loading places, the delivery truck often just stops in the street.
All right. So there would be, right now, a truck could actually stop on the north side of Hazel and unload, correct?
Right, they could swing on this section and pull it here. A truck could park here for loading.
Mhm.
However, our ordinance doesn't allow applicants to count on-street spaces for loading. You are allowed to count spaces within an alley, which is how a number of properties within the downtown are able to allocate their loading spots. However, this does not have an alley abutting it.
Okay, I thought of one more question. On the notice that was sent out, on the second page, you indicate they're required to have 15 parking spaces on the first floor. You only got 14, but I noticed in the minutes from the planning board that they can count space down below. Is that true?
Correct. So again, in the planning department and the zoning ordinance, we go by total. So it would be all of the commercial on the first floor plus all of the residential floors 2 through 5. What does that requirement in parking total, which is 75? We then count all of the spaces on the first floor and underground. That's 84. So it shows an excess. And so also when they go to final site plan with the planning board and they label these spaces, right now we have retail. So we assume a 1 per 300 on that label. However, this property is in the B3 zone. The B3 zone is the only one in downtown where you are allowed fitness studios. So hypothetically, let's say if they made that a yoga studio, then their requirement for the first floor commercial becomes 14, which they have right here. But that's hypothetically speaking. Within the planning department and the zoning ordinance, we purely go by totals after adding everything up. So how they allocate access to the parking spaces, first floor versus underground, that's between the tenants and the building owner.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Miller.
Yes, I had two items I wanted to address. Mr. Cowan, and maybe you can confirm this for me. I'm kind of comparing the existing conditions out there to what's proposed. And I believe the entire, almost 2/3 of that existing building is actually a parking garage that faces Hazel and Big Woodward.
Right, I haven't been inside the actual parking garage, but you can see it from the street. I walk by there often walking to lunch. Within the gates, it seems like most of the southernmost building, the Talmer Bank site, was mostly parking.
Yeah, there's not even glass in the windows. They're just bars. So it's an open,
Right.
it's an open deck for over half of that length along what I measured along Hazel. And so what I'm looking at is the proposed plan is putting that 1,000 square feet of retail on the corner of Big Woodward and Hazel. And so there's actually a mitigation of 30 feet that will be turned over to retail on the Hazel side, and about 30 feet of mitigation to kind of the parking deck wall on the Big Woodward side. So the condition, I believe, between the existing and proposed, the proposed is mitigating or making better that condition of having parking right along the exterior facades of the buildings on both the Big Woodward side and the Hazel side.
Correct, and the planning board commented on that as well, in that the two proposed retail tenant spaces along the corners, they liked how it was facing the two major roads and were activating the major thoroughfares from the building, and we're in favor of that.
That's how I saw it also. Thank you. And the second thing, and I did go over the two planning board approvals. They were both unanimous. And I didn't see any concerns of public safety at all. The reason I bring this up is a few meetings ago, I think we had a proposal that had some similarities, but that was turned down partially or maybe completely because there were safety concerns about the traffic patterns, etc. But for this proposal, I didn't read anywhere that there were any safety concerns here.
Right. I believe it was June 24th. The subject property had a community impact study go to the planning board. Part of a community impact study is a traffic study. And they talked about the only way in and out, the only ingress and egress for the parking on site is off of Hazel. And they mentioned how Hazel is not a majorly traveled road, low traffic patterns, low travel speed, and that access to the parking would not create a queuing issue or safety issue. I believe one of the applicants who came a few months ago, I believe you were speaking to about the safety issue. Their first floor parking, the way that you would enter, be able to access them, and then be able to exit on Woodward, created a few safety issues that were raised within the community impact study report and led the planning board to recommend denial based on those safety grounds. So this subject property received approval for access to the parking spaces for their traffic study and for the parking spaces recommendation.
Thank you for that confirmation.
Mr. Reddy.
Mr. Cowan, quick question for you. What is the city trying to achieve with the ordinance regarding the required 20-foot setback from the facade?
Sure. Let me do a screen share again. One of the reasons that they try to require uses within the first 20 feet is to help activate the space and make it more pedestrian friendly. So, when you're walking by, when they have retail along the front, it seems like there's more going on in the space than, say, if you're walking along and you're just going by a brick wall or a concrete wall. The city has glazing standards to where the first floor has to have windows where you can see inside and see what's going on. They believe that having active first floor uses creates a more enhanced character of the downtown area. However, and for instance, we have the retail frontage requirement going through downtown. That's on this downtown overlay. Anything within this red line, you have to meet the requirement for retail, and it has to be within the first 20 feet of that frontage. And that's to help activate the downtown space. But the planning board, I think, was more sympathetic for this applicant due to Hazel being very small and the shape of the lot and them trying to get in as much retail as possible on the first floor. Doing their best job to meet the intent of activating the space.
Very good, thank you.
I have a couple of questions as well, Mr. Cowan. In regards to the loading zone, I see on the diagram marked SD.1, they had a hatched out area on the call it the approach area between Woodward Avenue and the building.
Right here. This spot?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that an allowable off-street loading area?
That is not. It would have to be on site. The zoning ordinance allows loading spaces to stick out a little bit, but they would have to be screened. So, my impression is that I also believe that is MDOT territory, MDOT owned space. And I believe that they showed the dimensions on this hash mark is 12 by 56 for like a large tractor trailer, like a Walmart. type of van, just to give, I think it's a point of reference. The applicant will probably point to the intent more so than that. But I believe it's to provide a frame of reference to coincide with what was on this page to show, okay, here's different size vans.
Okay. I just guess I have a question, generally speaking. Did the planning board discuss whether or not loading trucks would have to be stopping on Woodward to back into that loading dock?
To my recollection, I'm not sure. So I didn't see it in the minutes, and going by memory, I don't want to give a definite answer on that.
Okay.
Sorry.
I mean, I would hope that's something they would have addressed, and maybe the applicant recalls better. I mean, if anything, it seems safer to have them pulling into the MDOT right away, which I'm assuming trucks do all the time, and unloading there. But I know that's legally not allowed. The other question I have, or series of questions I have, is there is no a retail requirement on Hazel Street, right?
Correct. The retail frontage is only facing South Old Woodward.
So just for the sake of discussion, let's say we don't grant them this variance and they don't get the variance A, excuse me, for those 7 spots.
Mm-hmm.
Are they required to put anything there, or they could just leave that as open space without parking, assuming they have enough parking spaces?
That's a good question. I would assume that they would fill it with some type of commercial use. However, it wouldn't have to meet the requirements of retail. So it could be an office use. However, I would have to go back to the ordinance on requirements of commercial space within that 20 feet. My impression of the ordinance is just says you can't have parking within the first 20 feet.
Okay.
However, I'd have to go back and check.
Yeah, I was just curious whether or not if you don't have parking and you don't have a retail requirement, whether or not they could just leave that as open space, or they had to put something alternate there.
Chairman Canvasser, to follow up on that, I think that Brooks is correct. He's going down the right path. It's the ordinance doesn't require retail there. It just can't be parking, but it could be anything else. It could be mechanical. It could be office space. Like Brooks mentioned, it could be retail space, but it could be anything else but parking.
Okay, so if they just wanted to put a curb there and put shopping carts, for example, I'm assuming that's not prohibited, correct?
I believe because it's within the overlay that they have a 0-foot setback requirement. The building has to be placed along the edge, but then what the use behind that is up to the applicant.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. Board members, any other questions before we hear from the petitioner? Okay, thank you, Mr. Cowan. All right, Mr. Rassel, I believe you indicated you would be speaking on behalf of the petitioner.
That's correct. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you bring up his picture, please? Oh, there he is. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening, Richard Rassel, 380 North Old Woodward. I'm with the Williams, Ratner, and Plunkett firm in Birmingham. We represent the petitioner here this evening. We appreciate your time. This project, of course, we have worked on for a very significant amount of time with the planning board, including, of course, the completion of a very thorough community impact study. And the planning board met on 2 occasions and considered the application. We received unanimous approval. In connection with the design that's presented to you this evening, of course, we're asking for 2-dimensional variances that have been outlined by the board and certainly Mr. Cowan. In connection with this property, the primary consideration that we'd ask you to take into account tonight are considerations are 2 very unique features, really 3, but 2 that jump right out in considering a practical difficulty or a hardship imposed on a property owner. One is in particular with regard to the width of this property. This is a very unique shaped property. It's only 80 feet wide. as it runs along Hazel Street, as it runs east, west to east or east to west. In connection with that, we have to provide, as we do the D4, adequate parking for this project. The project's been designed to be D4 compliant. It's a mixed-use project. It takes advantage of the retail component that the city has called for in both its future plan and in connection with its zoning ordinance to provide for retail on the ground floor and to provide for residential on the top 4 floors. And in doing so, and I appreciated Mr. Cowan's comment about activating the retail and activating the storefronts and activating those streets along which the facades are intended to be activated. We've done just what the ordinance requires as it relates to Old Woodward, where the 0 lot line frontage with retail is called for. We have done the same along Old Woodward, where the street scape and retail activates the plan. Along Hazel, you'll note from the design plans, and this was recognized in detail by the planning board, the facade is not intended to activate the streetscape. It's not active, called out for streetscape in the city's planning documents. So Hazel Street becomes a thoroughfare between two major thoroughfares designed to attract both street walk and active participants in the downtown business community. In doing so on this property and designing it the way that we did, we ran into an obstacle when it related to the recognition Mr. Cowan made that this is the only D4 property in the city that is excluded from what is, of course, the parking assessment district. The parking assessment district, if we were to be included, like all other D4 properties are, would substantially reduce the amount of on-site parking required for the site. And by not being able to offset in public parking per the ordinance, we were required to on-site park. And in doing so, we have tried to take a responsible approach in presenting to you and to the planning board a plan that called for 84 spots. 84 spots provides not only a adequate number of spots to service our retail customers, but to provide parking for not only just the residents of the proposed residential development, but also, of course, guests that will be visiting the site. We don't want to impose a parking burden on the city, but we're not in the parking assessment district. So we, in effect, find ourselves, having been excluded from that district, penalized by the ordinance's requirement on the Hazel side, where we designed that we had to put the on-site parking by this requirement that we have to move back off the sidewalk or the frontage 20 feet. In doing so, we would lose a substantial amount of square footage, and thus, contrary, we believe, to the spirit and intent of the ordinance, we would not be meeting the purpose, which is to activate the streetscapes on the 2 major thoroughfares, but to lose a very substantial amount of square footage along Hazel Street, which is not considered within the spirit and intent of that setback requirement. That brings to me to the third unique feature, which of course is the fact that we do have 3 streetscapes here. We do have 3 facades. And while we meet every ordinance requirement, and this has been an extraordinarily carefully designed project, working in cooperation with the planning board, we do find that we lay out what we think is a very compelling case for a hardship or a practical difficulty as it relates to the parking. And we have laid that out not only in Mr. Long's December 9th letter, but in the supplemental letter authored by my partner, Mr. Ratner, that's part of your packet dated January 8th. I would respectfully request just a moment to go through the ordinance requirements as it relates to the granting of a practical difficulty, but I would like to address the loading. The loading issue finds itself also an anomaly here. We have a oversized loading area that we built. The ordinance requirements call for a 40-foot long, 12-foot wide, 14-foot high loading area, taking into account that there just wasn't adequate square footage here at a second loading area without otherwise being penalized in the D4 district and the loss of usable square footage. The architects here were careful to design a loading dock which exceeds the single requirement substantially by being 30 feet 19 feet wide, and 18 feet high. And as shown to you on schematic drawing 3 that Mr. Cowan pulled up earlier, taking into account the use here, which is, if this isn't a restaurant use, we're not going to be having deliveries of foodstuffs and other major deliveries that would come in. Mr. Cowan used the example of a large Walmart truck. Those aren't the kind of deliveries for loading and unloading here that are going to need to be accommodated to this structure. This structure is going to accommodate retail, which has a very small and very controlled loading requirement that can be very carefully coordinated and very carefully scheduled. And that is the same for the moving in and out of residential uses, which we feel, and confirmed by the community impact study we submitted to the planning board, we feel can adequately be serviced by the oversized single loading dock that we provide on the Old Woodward side, which can accommodate 2 trucks in one instance or one very large moving truck. And to answer one of the board members' previous questions, yes, the oversized truck reference aiming north and south in the right-of-way was intended for reference to show what a truck that would be unnecessary for this project, i.e. a Walmart or an Amazon delivery truck, would look like in that instance. We feel in connection with the letter that we wrote to you dated January 8th, that there are special conditions applicable to this property, which prevents this property owner from using its property like those that are similarly situated or for a permitted purpose. We're obviously designing this building and using it for a permitted purpose. We have met the intents and goals of the master plan or the city's future plan and the ordinance to design a mixed-use project that will greatly improve both the streetscape and the visual effect and service residents in the city. I did appreciate Mr. Miller's comment earlier that this is a substantial mitigation of what is an existing phenomenon along Hazel Street, where there is a very large and some might say unsightly caged parking service area now that would be tremendously mitigated by the proposal, in addition to the investment being made here to design a well thought out building that will accommodate additional residents. Not only do we meet the special conditions requirement, but the literal enforcement of the chapter would result in an unnecessary hardship. This is largely driven by the 80-foot wide lot, which would cause us, if we had to set back 20 feet or add another loading dock, would cause us to unnecessarily lose substantial square footage. This would result because the loading dock that's unnecessary and a setback off a non-retail frontage street on Hazel would cause obviously the corresponding loss in buildable area that would not be applicable. The property is located within the parking district for which for some reason this D4 property is excluded, and it's the sole and unique outlier in that regard. But coming back to the spirit and intent, which would be preserved here, this building is called for, and this building, this development, this is called for in the ordinance. These are what we feel are reasonable requests to deviate from the strict enforcement that would otherwise cause a hardship if literally enforced. The granting of the variance will not be contrary to the spirit and purpose of the ordinance. I've spoken to that just a moment ago. I would note that the downtown overlay requires buildings to be placed on the frontage line, which we have done. And we are intending to try to comply with that by placing this very small, we think reasonable parking area along Hazel Street rather than on one of the major frontages, which of course would then have to be set back 20 feet, contrary to the spirit and intent, which calls for the activation of the street fronts. So we've chosen Hazel as the place to, we think, responsibly self-park in lieu of being able to do so under the, or do alternately under the parking assessment district. We've reduced the street level space available. I'm sorry, if these variances were not granted, this would unnecessarily reduce the street level space available for pedestrian accessibility and retail activity, which is contrary to the spirit and intent. The granting of the variances requested will result in substantial justice. We talked about how we are an outlier in the D4 district. We otherwise fully comply. Our property neighbors to the north and the south are in the D5 district, and if we were similarly zoned, irrespective of the height issue, or we were in the parking assessment district, we would be dealing with different ordinance criteria, which may or may not be workable on this 80-foot lot in any event. But we feel that this development, as the planning board agreed, molds in seamlessly with the type of development that Birmingham wants and the type of investment the city is looking for in this area. Lastly, because of the lot restrictions, lastly, because of the exclusion from the special assessment district, or from the parking assessment district, and from the unique feature that we have 3 facades, 3 streets in which to deal with here, we feel that this is not a self-created difficulty in any way, shape, or form. All of you seem to indicate that, and we respectfully thank you for reading the planning board minutes, because the planning board members were very effusive in their belief that this was an appropriate request on our part to the Board of Zoning Appeals. That, of course, was their opinion, but we think it does carry some weight, as they had carefully studied this project and the community impact study that went along with it in connection with their unanimous approval of this project. And they're really thanking both the applicant and the planning board, thanking each other at the end for their hard work in developing what we think is going to be another tremendous asset to the downtown in Birmingham. I, of course, could go on. I think that the Board of Zoning Appeals members certainly will ask questions of me. Mr. Long is on the call if there's a need for a technical architectural issue, but please let me answer your questions. And we respectfully requested both variances be granted this evening. And we thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Board members, any questions for the petitioner? Mr. Morganroth.
Mr. Rassel, did you hear the comment from one of the board members about the need for the spots that are requiring a variance, that if you are achieving the maximum number of spots, parking spots required, was there a consideration to not put up parking there, but put office space or some of the other mechanicals for the building?
Well, it's a very good question. And actually, there was some dialogue earlier today on that with the petitioner. The petitioner strongly feels that in order to service the guests of the retail and the guests of the owners of the units that will be in this location, that it's important that the 84 spots be provided. And in doing so, the recognition is that we can't, either by ordinance or by really practicality, divert these guests, whether they be retail or residential guests or owners, to parking spots off-site. It's just not convenient at this location. And we thought the appropriate and responsible development tool here was to park on site, which we fully do. Obviously, is an expensive feature of any development, and by making that investment, we felt we were making the responsible decision, Mr. Morgan.
And I guess in my mind, the concern that within the first 20 feet, there's something that isn't visually appealing from a retail perspective. Was there any consideration of means by which to blur or hide or obscure the fact that it's parking?
I'd have to ask Mr. Long to address that, if that'd be okay. I know typically the board would like one speaker on that, but the alternative design features would have to be something addressed by Mr. Long, but I'm sure alternatives certainly considered. I would note, if the board would like to hear from Mr. Long, that we are and have taken great pains to try to create a facade along Hazel that's appealing in connection with the otherwise, we think, sharp-looking development. And as Mr. Miller noted, this is a substantial mitigation of an existing feature that some might deem undesirable. But if I'll leave it to the board as to whether Mr. Long can speak at this time about that question.
Yeah, as long as we're sticking to the technical aspects of the design, I don't have a problem with Mr. Long speaking. I have a similar question along those lines, so I think that would be helpful.
Chris, I think you're muted. Well, he can't hear me.
You can unmute him.
He's connecting to the audio. Let's.
Still muted.
Can
Can you guys hear me now? No. You can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Okay. To answer Mr. Morganroth's question about the 20-foot on Hazel, you know, the last thing I would want to do as an architect is put the mechanical in that yard space, that 20-foot space, and most of the mechanical is going on the roof just for the purposes of hiding it. So additionally, the parking would be screened and needs to be screened for the first 30 inches, I believe it is. Brooks could probably answer that question directly, but I think it's 30 or 36 inches that needs to be screened. So we intend to do that, certainly. And the elevations actually bear that out.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Long, before we put you back on mute. So let's just say we didn't grant the variance. You got these spaces, you don't have to put retail there. Is there something else that can occur in that area, or is it just going to be a blank area? I mean, I guess. Any thoughts?
So the idea of actually putting the idea of actually putting additional office space there is, be it either office or retail space, is not a good thing for obvious reasons. I don't think that either would survive. And then if we do add the additional office or retail space, we need to provide additional parking for that as well. So it's a, you know, it's doesn't work. So
Okay.
Parking became the most obvious thing. We tried to activate the corners as best as we could with retail, which is required by the ordinance and certainly within the spirit of the design of the building. And providing parking for the efficiency of the building as well as for the convenience of the guest and retail shoppers, hopefully we have those, was the highest and best use of that property. And again, it's not a retail environment. It's a difficult environment. We face a concrete wall to the south. That would be Birmingham Place or 555 building, excuse me, 555 building. So we're requesting 7 spaces because that's pretty much the highest and best use.
Okay, thank you. Board members, I'm hearing a pretty bad echo from Mr. Long. So before I place him back on mute, does anybody have any specific questions for him? Okay, thank you, Mr. Long. I'm going to have you mute your line. Okay, board members, any other questions for the petitioner? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Rassel.
Thank you.
We will open it to public comment. Does anybody from the public wish to comment on this appeal? Again, please use the raise hand feature, and I'll look to see if we have anybody. I don't see anybody yet. I do see one, Mr. Howe.
Yes, hi, good evening. Mr. Canvasser, my name is Patrick Howe. I represent Birmingham Place Condominium Association. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. We've been involved with this, monitoring this development for many years, and we just want to participate tonight and ask the Board of Zoning Appeals to consider the neighborhood and the neighboring buildings in making their decision. You know, we're not experts in loading zones and whether one zone or two zones is appropriate. And we just ask that the board consider whether one zone is sufficient. We're in a time of increased deliveries and logistical services, everything from food deliveries to Amazon to Walmart. And we ask that the board and staff, we rely on their expertise in determining whether this loading zone is appropriate, contrary to what the zoning ordinance provides. We also ask that you consider the neighborhood and the district in determining whether the parking layout and the variance requested is also appropriate and not detrimental to the neighbors. We appreciate your work on this, and that's all we have this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. That actually leads to a question, Mr. Rassel. For the residents, the Amazon packages, are those going to come in through the lobby off of Old Woodward? The mail, and I see a mail room. Is that where the incoming residential mails are going to come?
That's my understanding, Mr. Campbell.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else from the public wish to comment? Seeing none, board members, anything else for the petitioner? Okay, thank you. Board members, would anybody like to make a motion on this appeal? Mr. Lilly.
Yes, with regard to appeal 1-01, I move to grant the variances as advertised, and I would tie this motion to the plans as presented, and this variance would be conditioned upon the petitioner establishing the 7 parking spaces along Hazel. And I just like to, before I go into the reasons why I'm making this motion, I just like to note the fact, while the planning board likes this project, the fact that they like it does not establish a practical difficulty. So even though the planning board likes it, the petitioner still has to establish a practical difficulty. I think in this case, the petitioner has. I note that the existing building already has parking within 20 feet of the building frontage facing Hazel, and that this property is the only parcel in the D4 zoning district, which is not part of the parking assessment district. And as Mr. Miller had pointed out, there is a mitigation of this parking along Hazel, and the person indicated
Mr. Lilly, you're fading out.
Okay. The petitioner has indicated that this is a unique parcel. Well, I don't know how it's unusual, but there are some other parcels that face on 3 streets, one being the Greenleaf Trust Building, another one being 280 North Woodward. Both of those are narrow buildings. The advantage they have over the petitioner in this case is that they are in the parking assessment district, so they don't have to provide on-site parking. So I think the biggest problem and the biggest driver on granting these variances is the fact that this parcel is in the D4, but is not in the parking assessment district. To require the petitioner to comply with the ordinance, would be unduly burdensome. Granting the variance does substantial justice to the petitioner and the surrounding neighbors. The problem is, well, as I indicated, the property is not, it's unusual, it's not unique, but the big problem is the fact that it's in the D4 district, but not in the parking assessment district. This is something that was not self-created. And again, as I stated before, this is tied to the plans as presented and conditioned upon the petitioner installing the 7 parking spaces along Hazel.
Second.
We have a motion. We have a second by Mr. Morgenroth. Board members, any discussion? Mr. Morgenroth?
As seconding, I do support my colleague's motion. I do think that being in a D4 with no access to the parking assessment district is one of the most unique pieces of this property. Living very close to this, I recognize that Hazel Street is more of a pass-through from the downtown to Woodward Avenue. I travel it every day, and I do think it's a significant improvement from the existing structure and the amount of parking you can see in the current building. And I think that establishing a loading zone that is mitigating with more width and a space to allow for 2 trucks that may be appropriate for residential use is not meeting the code, not meeting the ordinance, but a interesting way to mitigate. And so for those reasons and the reasons that the motion were made, I would support this.
Any other comments? Mr. Miller?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that from the planning board, the September 23rd meeting, they did mention that separation of 14 to 15 spaces on grade and the rest of the parking below would allow a separation from retail use above and the residential use below. And in their words, they said that that would certainly maintain some security for the residents to have their parking separated from the retail above. So I think that was just an added plus for the proposed design.
Anyone else have any comments? I'm also going to support this. And one of the reasons is the fact that we have Hazel Street, which doesn't require retail to front it. And I think as I heard, we have these spaces that really there's no other requirement to be there. You don't have to put office there. You don't have to put retail there. And I think the ability to add additional parking where it's so desperately needed throughout the city is a good thing on this project. As it relates to the loading spaces, I think we've seen a drawing that shows the practicality of how these loading spaces are best going to be used. I also think whether or not there is another loading bay or not, I think the reality is that you're going to see loading either on Woodward, on Hazel Street, or in the MDOT right away. I know that the trucks pulling the MDOT right away for Birmingham Place all the time. I lived there for a few years, and that's, I know that firsthand. So, I think that the situation here and the unique facts support giving both of these variances. So I'll support the motion. Anyone else have any comments? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Charles Lilly,
Yes.
Eric Morganroth,
Yes.
Francis Rodriguez,
Yes.
Ron Reddy,
Ron, you're on mute.
Sorry, Bruce muted me there. Yes.
okay, Jason Canvasser,
Yes.
Richard Lilly,
Yes.
John Miller.
Yes.
Okay, congratulations. The variances are granted. Mr. Johnson, do we have any correspondence or any business not on our agenda tonight?
We do not.
Okay, does anybody from the public wish to speak on anything that was not on our agenda tonight? Again, if you do, please raise your hand. Seeing none, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Saw a bunch of hands. Mr. Richard Lilly, you'll get that.
Okay.
And do we have a second? Mr. Ron Reddy, second. Please call the roll.
Richard Lilly,
Yes.
Ron Reddy,
Yes.
Jason Canvasser,
Yes.
Charles Lilly,
Yes.
John Miller,
Yes.
Eric Morganroth,
Yes.
Francis Rodriguez.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you. Our meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone.
good night, everyone.
Good night.